Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here this afternoon. My name is Jean Lee. I am the director of the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and I am serving as your moderator today. I'm going to use a slideshow to lay out what it is we're going to be doing today. So it's been about a year and a half since we first heard President Trump mention the Indo-Pacific strategy, and that was a hint that the U.S. government might be changing its approach to the region. Of course, the broadening of the region was one sign. However, it's been a little sparse in detail, I have to say. No offense, Ambassador. And in the interim, we've had a few fact sheets and statements and speeches come out from Washington and from the Trump administration. At the same time, just a few days before the president's speech in November 2017, we had President Moon Jae-in issue a new policy for his South Korean government, the new Southern policy, which suggested a change and a shift in South Korea's approach and engagement to Southeast Asia. And so what we thought we would do here at the Wilson Center is to explore, investigate, and perhaps analyze what each of these two policies mean, not only for their countries, for the broader region, but also for U.S.-ROK relations. Are there areas where these two policies can overlap and where these two governments can work together to come up with policies that enhance cooperation and also enhance both countries' separate and joint shared values in the broader Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region? So this is really something we're very lucky at think tanks to have the space to be able to investigate, study, and analyze these issues without having to represent the government, and perhaps to create a space where we can discuss and debate what these policies mean, and also come up with some policy recommendations for each government in not only how to develop these policies, but also how to message them to their people and to their friends and perhaps even their foes. And so what we've done today is assemble an amazing group, a great group of some of the best minds on this topic, both current and former U.S. and South Korean government officials, keeping in mind, oh, look who turned up, coming in through the front door. We haven't even gotten as far as introductions. Don't worry, you're okay. What we have up here on the screen, just to give you, because there has been so little detail, a little bit of a timeline. I'm not sure you can read it, but a little bit of a timeline of the two policies. On the top, you see the Indo-Pacific strategy. On the bottom, the new Southern policy. So you can see, in a sense, how they've been developing over the past year and a half, almost simultaneously. Now, we should keep in mind that we are expecting the acting Defense Secretary, Patrick Shanahan, to unveil or reveal some more details about this Indo-Pacific strategy in the coming days at the Shangri-La Dialogue. I don't think he's spoken yet, right? I think it's going to be in the next day or two. So keep that in mind. In the next day or two, we will have more detail about what the U.S. strategy is. I'm just going to quickly go through some of the objectives of our discussion today. An introduction to the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and its core values. We've heard this phrase repeatedly from Secretary Pompeo, advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific region, focusing on certain areas, economics, governance, security. I think we'd like to focus, if we're looking at areas of overlap, here are some of the programs that we've seen discussed or mentioned by Vice President Pence, Secretary Pompeo, and Alex Wong in the past. Patrick, you look like you want to jump in.
No, I'm listening intently.
highlights of the program or the policy so far, and then just some of the core values that we've seen laid out by the South Korean government: promoting greater mutual understanding, developing a mutually beneficial trade relationship, and maintaining a safe and peaceful regional security environment. Some more highlights, and I don't want to be stepping on your toes, but these are some of the areas that President Moon has laid out for how he envisions carrying out this policy. And then areas for cooperation, and these are some of the aspects that we'd like to discuss today. Expanded engagement with Asia, economic development, security cooperation, infrastructure, and governance. So we've been in meetings all week with our counterparts in South Korea at think tanks across Seoul and have had incredibly productive discussions about how to look at these two different policies, these burgeoning policies, and also where they overlap. So it's a bit of a Venn diagram, if you will, and that area in the middle is where we see potential areas of overlap. Okay, now let me introduce our speakers. Actually, I don't know that they need much introduction. To my right, Ambassador Harris, who really doesn't need an introduction, but I will just give you a quick bio in case you need it. He was a commander. He was commander of the Pacific Command and now the Indo-Pacific Command, although I think that moniker came after you left the Pacific Command, right?
As I was leaving, because before I actually turned over to Phil Davidson, the first speaker at the change of command, the first speaker at the change of command ceremony was then Secretary Mattis, who announced it. So there was about 15 or 20 minutes of time that I was the Indo-Pacific Command commander.
So we can't blame you.
Well, actually, you can blame me because I made the initial request, suggestion formally that we change the name of it.
Oh, great. So you can tell us a little bit about what was behind that thinking.
At this very moment?
No, a little bit later on.
I'd be happy to do it. But
I do want to mention that I'm very proud. He's the first Asian American to hold a 4-star rank in the U.S. Navy and the first to head PACOM. So I'm very proud as a fellow Asian American. And as you know, he's been here since, let's see, he became ambassador to Seoul.
Oh, in July. Last July, so coming up on 11 months.
Great. And I've had the pleasure of having you at a Wilson Center event last October as well. So thank you so much for working with us. And I want to mention that the embassy has been fantastic in helping support this kind of research that we've been doing on this topic, supporting our discussions with our counterparts in South Korea. So thank you so much. It's an important topic, and we hope that we're able to produce something productive today. To my left, Chae Won-gi. One second, I'm just getting my bios. He's a professor in the Department of International Economy and Trade Studies and head of the Center for ASEAN India Studies at the Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and I believe it's been about a year since this center has been.
Yeah, last February.
Last February. And so a new focus for the Academy. And he holds a BA and an MA in International Relations from Seoul National and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Washington in Seattle. And his area of focus is the international political economy, regional cooperation and architecture in East Asia, and climate change negotiation. Now, to his left, we've got Abe Denmark, my colleague, Asia Program Director at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense, overlooking the East Asia portfolio. So somebody who has a long history in military engagement in the region, but is has a fantastic approach to this issue. I really look forward to sharing with for him to share with all of you his thoughts on how these two different policies can work together. And to his left, we have Patrick Buchan of CSIS. You will hear very soon that he is not an American, although we have yet he claims he can do an American accent. He is an Australian and a former Australian government official who did spend some time as well in the Department of Defense, if I'm right. helping to craft some policy. So he's got some government, both U.S. and Australian government experience, and has now joined the think tank world. So it's a little bit of a caveat there. And then Joseph Yoon, of course, former ambassador. To our far left, he's a senior advisor for Asia at the U.S. Institute for Peace, and has extensive experience. Of course, we know him mostly as an envoy on North Korea, but he has extensive experience in Southeast Asia as well. So we invited him to lend some of his expertise, both having worked in the Trump administration, having worked in the Obama administration in those regions, and to provide now, as a former government official, a little bit of his take on areas of overlap between these two policies. Now, I would like to turn the stage over to Ambassador Harris to perhaps answer some of these questions and lay out some talking points on what this strategy is.
Thanks, Jean. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes, and then I know my fellow panelists here will say a few words. Then I'll look forward to some questions from you and from the audience. I think it's a fair approach. Anybody not like that approach? Okay. Let me just begin by saying that we're here to talk about the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and the Republic of Korea's new Southern policy. I'm pleased to say that from my perspective, these two agreements, these two strategies have natural synergies that provide us and all of us really great opportunities. I'll just talk briefly about what Jean had mentioned earlier, what we were just talking about up here, and that's Indo-PACOM. So when I was the PACOM commander, I used to say, sort of jovially, but it's actually true, that the Pacific Command area of responsibility stretched from Hollywood to Bollywood and penguins to polar bears. So that gives you a sense of the expanse of the U.S. Pacific Command, over 50% of the globe and most of the world's populations. So I felt that it was important to accurately describe that. Pacific Command, rightfully so, should talk about the Pacific, but if you want to talk about the Indian Ocean, the importance of the Indian Ocean, the importance of countries like Australia, which are actually both Pacific and Indian Ocean countries, India, and all of the issues we have in the Indian Ocean littoral, then we should change the name of the command to more accurately reflect ground truth. So I made that recommendation. All I did was recommend it. The Secretary of Defense made the decision, and he agreed with that, and henceforth Pacific Command is now the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So that's the story on that. All right. The U.S. has a vision to advance the free and open Indo-Pacific. This vision is built on principles that are widely shared throughout this region: ensuring the freedom of the seas and skies, insulating sovereign nations from external coercion, promoting market-based economies, open investment environments, fair and reciprocal trade, good governance, and respect for individual rights. The choice that countries in the region face is not a stark one between two great powers. Rather, it's the choice to preserve, further strengthen, and improve the rules-based international order that have helped this region grow and thrive, or not. That's the choice. I think President Trump put it really well during his 2017 speech in Vietnam when he described the countries of the Indo-Pacific as a beautiful constellation of nations, each its own bright star and satellites to none. Each one a people, a culture, a way of life, a home. So it's this conscious decision that will impact all of us for years to come and the lives of our future generations. Making strategic partnerships with partner countries and regional institutions such as ASEAN is at the center of America's Indo-Pacific policy. Our strategy is inclusive. As Secretary Pompeo has said, our Indo-Pacific vision excludes no nation. We seek to work with anyone to promote a free and open Indo-Pacific as long as that cooperation adheres to the high standards that our citizens demand. The U.S. is committed to expanding engagement in three vital areas through the Indo-Pacific policy: economics, governance, and security. Now, while our new U.S. initiatives are important, the region's needs are far too great for any single nation to tackle alone. And that's where leaders like South Korea, which is a model for other countries and which has its own policy priorities for the region, are poised to expand and grow existing partnerships with the U.S. to realize mutually shared objectives. President Moon's new Southern policy for expanding engagement with South and Southeast Asia under the pillars of peace, people, peace, and prosperity creates several areas for cooperation between the U.S. and the ROK. Some of the most promising include infrastructure, cybersecurity, civilian law enforcement and maritime security capacity building, energy, and health security. In fact, on May 17th, under the new Southern policy, the ROK announced that the Korea International Cooperation Agency will double its official development assistance to 6 ASEAN countries: Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Timor-Leste. So if you're counting, that's 7, not 6. So it's 7, to about $150 million each year by 2023. The plan highlights 5 key areas for support: higher education, agricultural development, ICT, urban development, and transportation. We're hoping our own U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, can help support some of these ROK initiatives. We look forward to continuing that dialogue together with the ROK to see what's in the art of the possible. Now, fortunately, our two countries already have a track record of close cooperation on a range of global and regional issues. Just last week, the U.S. and the ROK co-hosted an event in Bangkok that looked at security, business, and policy challenges related to the crucial issue of new 5G systems development. I look forward to continuing to expand these and other areas of collaboration and to further discuss our shared objectives to that end. So thank you very much, and I'll yield the podium, microphone, table, panel back to Jean. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. I love the analogy, Hollywood to Bollywood, penguins to polar bears. And I recognize that this was something that you instigated, but that what you were looking for was a description that perhaps encompassed a broader range and a broader region, and perhaps even included a maritime element. And we'll get back to that later. I have some questions for you about that. I like that you also held up South Korea as a model to some of the other countries in this region. This is something that I would certainly like to discuss with you, Professor Che. Can South Korea serve as a model of a country that is a developing nation, that was a developing nation, is now a developed nation, and can serve as an inspiration to countries in the region? Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jean. My name is Won Gi-cho from Korea National Diplomatic Academy. I kind of feel pressured because I'm the only Korean surrounded by a bunch of Americans and Australians. So, yeah, I don't know why I was being invited, but I have been working on New Southern policies since early last year. So I have been, one of my jobs is try to find a common ground between Korea's new regional initiative, New Southern policy, and America's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. So it's a point. Well, before beginning my presentation, I'd like to make clear that my presentation right now is purely based on my personal observation. Of course, I work for the government, but my presentation has nothing to do with the official stance of the government. This is my personal take on. I'd like to address 3 questions. The first one is, Ambassador Harris nicely described the core elements of New Southern policy, but so what is a New Southern policy, Korea? I'd like to talk about that. The second question is, It's about U.S. Indo-Pacific. So it is a general observation that Korea, from the beginning of President Trump's announcement about Indo-Pacific vision in November 2017, Korea has not been so enthusiastic about this vision. And I'd like to talk about, from my own perspective, why that is so. And the third question, with this thing, but there are lots of commonalities and similarities between these two initiatives. So I think there are ample rooms to work together with Americans under the FOIP and New Southern Policy, NSP. The first question, so what is Korea's New Southern Policy? I like to describe New Southern Policy in this way. I think, of course, we have three pillars. These are the guiding principles. But I think in terms of policy initiative, I think there are three core policy components embedded in New Southern Policy. The first one is economic. This is a external economic diversification strategy toward ASEAN and India, which is the most dynamic economic engine of the world economic growth. Well, this means realigning our external economic portfolios toward ASEAN and India and out of China. China is the #1 trading partner of South Korea, more than 25%. This is too heavy. So we have put too many eggs in China basket. So in this way, you could say that this New Southern Policy as an economic policy is kind of an attempt to have some sort of a soft economic decoupling about China. So I think that's the first policy component. The second one is it's a sort of a diplomatic rebalancing policy toward ASEAN and India. You know that in Korean diplomatic practices, we have sort of the biases toward four major powers, including US, China, Japan, and to a certain extent, Russia. So the rest of other countries are just secondary in our diplomatic orientation. And I think President Moon wants to try to change that. So we want to strengthen our bilateral ties with ASEAN countries and India and elevate them on a par with major powers. So, yeah. So in our New Southern Policy framework, ASEAN and India are not anymore secondary partners. So it is, they are now our priority diplomatic partners. I think that is at least the aspirations embedded in New Southern Policy. The third aspect of New Southern Policy is, I think, this is Korea's newly reinvigorated regional cooperation policy that intends to contribute to community building and architecture building efforts in the Asia Pacific. So I think this aspect of New Southern Policy as a new Korea's new regional cooperation policy is particularly relevant and important in the sense that Korea can face tough diplomatic dilemmas or challenges in the context of increasing U.S.-China strategic cooperation. So in that sense, I think it is kind of hedging efforts. So I think we aspire and prefer to have an inclusive regional architecture in the region that promotes multilateral norms and institutions rather than a regional environment in which voices of great power prevail. So we are, lots of people say this, we are particularly concerned about the possibility of being forced to make choice between China and US. So yeah, we want to avoid this kind of strategic dilemmas by working together with ASEAN in particular to create a diplomatic space to hedge against the pitfalls from U.S.-China strategy competition. So the second question, so then why Korea has not been so enthusiastic about U.S. FOIP initiative? Well, the official stance is not quite clear. You don't have many Korean official documents about our government's position on U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific. But the basic stance is that Korea, is open to and welcomes various regional initiatives put forth by countries like China's BRI, Americans' free and open Indo-Pacific, and India's activist policy. So basically, we are open and ready to cooperate with these various regional initiatives in order to enhance the connectivity and things like that. But if you look at the other side of Korea's stance about Americans in the Pacific, we have been taking a kind of lukewarm, neutral, or indifferent stance, if not negative, about U.S. in the Pacific. So this is quite a contrast compared to other American allies' response, like Japan or Australia. So you could say that Korea's proactive approach toward Trump administration's FOIP is not quite coming forth. So I'd like to point out two factors. One is China, the other is Japan. So I think it is the strategic nature of U.S. Indo-Pacific concept that deters Korea's proactive and positive response. President Moon's stance between U.S. and China is based on what he calls balanced diplomacy. In November 2017, he had an interview with Channel News Asia, and he specifically mentioned this concept. So the goal of this balanced diplomacy approach is to achieve an outcome, eventual outcome, that is to be diplomatically balanced between the between the China and U.S. So you have lots of different diplomatic maneuvers and approaches, but the eventual end outcome should be balanced. I think that's what he meant by balanced diplomacy. I think this is why he does not want to give a wrong signal to China. He does not want to give the impression that he takes sides with the U.S. in containing the rising influence of China by advocating and supporting the U.S. in the Pacific concept. So the logic behind this sort of lukewarm approach is that we need to have cooperation. So we need to solicit China's cooperation in order to deal with the DPRK. So yeah, I think the logic is like this. And so the second is Japan. I think, to my knowledge, it is Japan that first proposed and initiated this strategic concept of Indo-Pacific, and U.S. adopted this Japan-initiated concept. But if you look at the domestic political context of Korea, you can say that any kind of political and security cooperation with Japan is a politically risky business in domestic political context. So I think it is my personal observation that President Moon is taking a firm stance in not crossing this risky red line with Japan. So for example, according to a Korean media report, in 2017, President Moon reportedly stated that the security cooperation with Japan in the form of trilateral cooperation with the U.S. and Japan should be confined to dealing with North Korean military threat. So the trilateral security cooperation should not go beyond that line. That's my understanding. So for example, a joint naval exercise, for example, where the Japan's SDF is out of question. So to the extent that U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific strategy involves strategic concept with Japan, which has security implications. For example, in the area of maritime security, I think he feels very uncomfortable in participating in trilateral cooperation. So then the question is, then how can Korea and U.S. can cooperate under the FOIP and NSP, New Southern Policy? Well, from my personal perspective, with all these constraints, there are a lot of potential for Korea and U.S. to cooperate on the basis of U.S. free and open Indo-Pacific and Korea's New Southern Policy, based on many commonalities. First, I think Korea has vital interests in the values and principles that America is trying to uphold with this new Indo-Pacific concept. They do not conflict with our national interest. I mean, Ambassador Harris pointed out the freedom of seas and airways and things like that. Actually, these are not conflicting with our interests. Rather, these principles and values and norms corroborate our national interest as a maritime trading nation. So I think there is no prohibitive reason why we should not support the values and principles of the U.S. Indo-Pacific concept. So in this regard, I think we need to be a little more proactive and confident in taking a positive stance toward the values and principles upheld by U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think it is not about taking sides. Rather, it is about taking positions about the fundamental values and principles embedded in international order. So I think diplomatically this is a feasible range of actions we can take. Second, the New Southern Policy is not a policy that intends to alter Korea-U.S. alliance relations. This is not security policy. This is economic policy, this is a diplomatic policy, this is a regional cooperation policy. So, and also Korea-U.S. alliance is the backbone of our national security. So I think in this regard, we can actively seek common ground between these two regional initiatives, New Southern Policy and Free and Open Indo-Pacific, and expand the horizon of bilateral alliance. But one thing to caution from my personal perspective is that the collaboration between these two initiatives should be based on bilateral basis in order not to give wrong messages to neighboring countries. So if you have this sort of parameters, I think there are ample areas of cooperation because there are lots of overlapping elements and convergence between these two initiatives. Ambassador Harrison mentioned the infrastructure, digital connectivity, cybersecurity, development cooperation, and even Mekong cooperation. These are very promising areas of collaboration, I think. So the economic areas are the way to go. And also, people talk about the non-traditional security as an area of cooperation, but I think we can go further. I would call it the soft maritime security issues. For example, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief and capacity building support for ASEAN countries, for example, in the area of illegal fishing and the monitoring and capacities of their coast guards, for example. So these are called the maritime domain awareness issues. I think these areas are we can expand and strengthen bilateral cooperation. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Choi. I think you laid out beautifully what South Korea's concerns are in perhaps feeling like it might have to choose a side, the South Korean discomfort with the Indo-Pacific strategy, but also on the other hand, laying out potential areas of cooperation and shifting the focus from concern about being a shrimp among whales in the modern era to looking to see how the two countries can focus on collaboration. So I think you laid that out beautifully. I think you're absolutely right in that center position. And we did want to have a South Korean voice at this panel. Okay, Abe, did you want to share with us your thoughts on these two policies?
Sure. And thank you all for coming. And I'm just very pleased to be able to speak on this panel, such terrific experts, as well as with Ambassador Harris. I still have to check myself. Thank you. I still have to check myself to say Ambassador Harris, because I worked for 2 years in the Obama administration with Admiral Harris, and I can assure everybody here that even though we both have more facial hair than we did back then, he is still very much the same man as an ambassador that he is as an admiral, which I think is a wonderful continuity, and I'm so glad that he's here in Seoul as our ambassador. And I'm very glad that we can be here to talk about this topic. I think it's a very interesting and important topic for Americans and Koreans to explore. And again, I'll share the same caveat as Dr. Choi that these are my views, not those of the U.S. government. But personally speaking, I think the new Southern policy that's being discussed and has been announced by President Moon is very welcome. For many reasons. For a long time now, there's been lingering questions about the role of the Republic of Korea in Asia. Besides the North Korea issue, what role is Korea playing in the region? And I think, and especially when we look beyond the commercial role that Korea could play, that there seems to be, that Korea already plays a significant role in the region around the world, but it seems that there could be a more compelling description of the role that Korea could play, especially in Asia. And to me, the New Southern Policy is a way to address this issue and address some of the broader geopolitical questions that revolve around what's happening in the region besides what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. So broadly speaking, I think there's been three major trends that's been occurring in Asia over the last 5 years or so. The first being deepening and intensifying competition between China and the United States. The second being the proliferation and the increasing importance of minilateral institutions like the minilateral groupings of countries like the Quad, like trilateral groupings between the United States, Japan, Australia, United States, Japan, India, playing a more significant role in the region, and deepening economic integration across the region, primarily with the CPTPP. My concern is that Korea is, unfortunately, has not been playing a role in any of these trends, not playing a significant role in these trends. And I don't believe that Korea has to play a role in all of them, but I think it would be concerning for Korea to play a role in none of them. And so to me, the New Southern Policy is a way to start answering those questions and for Korea to play a more significant role in the major geopolitical trends in the region, especially minilaterals, especially economic integration. So you got a quick glance at a slide earlier about the overlap between the Indo-Pacific strategy and the New Southern Policy. And I wanted to dig into that a bit to describe where I think there's some overlap, where I think there's some differences. To me, the key overlap of this, though, before we get into the specific issue areas, there's two key overlaps, two key areas of commonality that everything, I think, can be based on. And this is, to me, the most important points, is that we agree on shared principles that Ambassador Harris described very well, that Dr. Che also talked about, that we both believe in a liberal order, on the rule of law, on political and economic liberalism. And this, to me, is the foundation of our cooperation, especially in the region. And especially the other area of overlap between the two sides, the other area of commonality, is that we are both focused on the same rough geographical area, wanting to do more with India, wanting to do more with Southeast Asia. In fact, I thought Ambassador Harris's brief explanation about why he wanted it to be Indo-PACOM, because of the importance of India, because of the broadening geographic aperture of what we look at when we look at this region, is the same realities that's driving Seoul to look at South and Southeast Asia as an important area. ASEAN countries are the #2 trading partner for Korea, the #2 investment partner for Korea. Like other countries in the neighborhood, Korea imports 70% of its natural gas through the South China Sea. So Korea has deep interests in these regions in a way that maybe have been unappreciated before, but I think is very important. The Samsung factory in Vietnam in itself is a major economic part of the role that Korea plays in Southeast Asia, and to me is an example of what we can build upon. But I also think there's some important differences and some uncertainties about where we go going forward. And I wanted to dig into those a bit. The first question, the first uncertainty is will Korea's engagement with the region be primarily bilateral or multilateral? As I mentioned, my sense is that the regional trend, economic trend, has been increasingly multilateral with the CPTPP. So to me, this raises the obvious question, is Korea going to join the CPTPP? And I understand, based on my conversations over the last few days, that that's a very tricky strategic and political issue for Korea. But I also think there's some geopolitical forces that would be pushing Korea in the same direction, just as I believe, again, personally speaking, that they should be driving the United States into the same direction of embracing regional economic multilateralism. So that's one area of uncertainty. And the second area of uncertainty is resources. For those of us who've developed strategies for government, we all know that we can write about strategy, we can talk about what our priorities are, but it really is not a real strategy until we can put money behind it, until resources reflect our priorities. And there's been some important announcements from Korea, from the government of Korea, about expanding investment in Southeast Asia over the next several years, and I think that's very good and very helpful. But I'll also be watching to see actual investments meeting objectives. But I also think there's some other areas that we need to look at beyond the major ASEAN countries that were listed before in terms of expanding Korea's strategic and geopolitical footprint in this region. For example, in the Pacific Islands, which is an increasingly important area that's getting more attention from the United States. The President of the United States recently hosted the presidents of several Pacific Island countries, which is a reflection of more attention from the United States in those areas. And so I took a look at development assistance that's been going to the Pacific Islands in recent years, between 2011 and 2018. It tells a very interesting story in that Australia, over that time, this is actually Australian data from an Australian think tank, the Lowy Institute. Australia invested roughly $8 billion in the Pacific Islands between those 2011 and 2018. China, slightly behind that. The United States invested $1 billion, Japan $874 million. Korea invested $38 million, a really small sum. The UAE invested more than Korea in the Pacific Islands during that time period. That to me tells a very significant story. And to me it shows that there's a lot that Korea can do to up its game in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and specifically in that case in the Pacific Islands. And so to me that's another area where we can compete. The overlap between our two approaches can cooperate. So Dr. Che, I thought, did a fantastic job of reflecting Korean views. I've been discussing these issues in Seoul for the last few days, and the issues that he mentioned, the concerns that he mentioned, are exactly reflected in what I've been hearing over the last few days, and I wanted to comment on them a bit, if I could. First on the main issues being the question about China, the question about Japan. In terms of U.S.-China competition, I think the fact that our competition is intensifying is undeniable. And it puts middle powers in increasingly uncomfortable positions. That's, I don't think, unique to Korea. I think that's true for countries all across the region. And I think it requires American policymakers, American strategists to recognize and to be deft in their diplomacy and deft in their approach to these countries. Just to, and I think this speaks to a bit of the issue with Japan as well, that this is not, and to be clear that this is not an effort by the United States to force Korea to somehow choose. That our cooperation is not based on a broad geopolitical game of competition, but rather on, as I said before, shared principles, shared interests. That these are good things to do without China entering into the conversation at all. With Japan, the question of Japan, obviously this is an issue of some significance from an American perspective. And I have heard several times in my conversations that there's a view in Korea that the Indo-Pacific strategy is somehow a Japanese strategy that the Americans have signed on to. My sense is that that's a very, that's not an accurate reading of how American policy is made, and I think it does Korea a disservice because it tinges the entire discussion with these questions about Korea-Japan relations that I think is not related and not helpful. In my experience, strategies are not something that countries shop around and ask other countries to sign on to. These are independent countries that have their own strategies, their own interests. The appropriate approach to my mind is for the United States to develop its strategy, Korea to develop its strategy, Japan to develop its strategy, all the other countries to develop their strategies, and then come together and see where those strategies may overlap. And where they overlap, to identify and work on opportunities where they can collaborate and help each other achieve their shared objectives. And that's, to me, all this is, that the United States, Japan, and Korea share a lot of the same principles, a lot of the same values, a lot of the same interests. And that, to me, suggests that we should be cooperating. And I think that my sense is that the United States would not be asking Korea to somehow sign on to a strategy, but rather to recognize that we have a lot of the same interests, and this is an opportunity to cooperate. From the last point I'd make on the Japan piece, during my time on the Pentagon, we spent a lot of time and a lot of effort to improve the relationship between Japan and Korea. And I think that for a lot of Americans who look at this issue, seeing a deterioration of the relationship between Seoul and Tokyo is frustrating. But that's not my reaction. My reaction is that it's sad, and it's disappointing, because I think it's unnecessary. And I think it actually, it damages it's not in the interest of the United States for this to happen, but I also think it's not in the interest of Korea or Japan. And so my hope is that we'll be able to get back to where we were and continue to make progress on these issues, because it's in our interest as well as the interest of Korea and Japan. So with all that said, I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity here. I think that we need to do a lot more work on identifying areas of cooperation between Korea and the United States in areas such as infrastructure development, which was mentioned before, especially in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Improving governance, which we both, I think, are exactly on the same page of, and is desperately needed in many parts of Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia. And even in security cooperation. The soft security cooperation, as Dr. Choi mentioned, I think would be tremendously beneficial to our interests and to Korea's interests. So if we can get past the questions and concerns generated by labels and those sorts of questions, and really just focus on principles, interests, and practical policy cooperation, I think there's a lot that we could do together to advance our mutual interests. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Abe. I can see a project coming up for us where we actually discuss what those projects might be, some practical applications. Patrick.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks, colleagues. Thank you, Ambassador. Thanks, colleagues on the panel. I've got to tell you, there's nothing worse than being the person on the panel that gets to speak after all the good points have been made. So I will try and take a different tack and come up with some different concepts and let's see how that plays out. Jen mentioned that as an Australian who's been in the United States for about 6 years, I can take a unique perspective, and I'll tell you why. Because I served in government in a middle power, working in strategic, defence and foreign policy, and then coming to the United States, serving in the Pentagon, where I served on the staff of the Office of the Secretary of Defence. All of a sudden I had to shift my thinking. How does a great power think? And what I learned is this. What makes the United States unique in the way that it goes about developing strategic policy and implementing that is understanding American history and understanding the history of American strategy and foreign policy. And what makes the United States unique, that I've worked out after 6 years in the United States, is that at the very heart of its policy development is the clash between values and interests. Values and interests. That lies at the very core of American foreign policy. And sometimes that equilibrium gets tilted the wrong way. So for example, let's take some modern examples. If you go too far down the values track, you get the Somalia situation. If you go too far down the interest track, you get Rwanda. So, let's talk about the current Indo-Pacific strategy. I think this strategy gets the mix right. I think it gets it right. I think it hits the sweet spot. Firstly, there is no great radical shift. When the Obama administration announced its Pacific rebalance, everyone ran to look for the metrics. How many ships and how many tanks have been moved from one theatre to another? And that was the wrong way to think about it. Because as the other panellists on this panel have spoken of, I think there are three great trends that have long run through the last 70 years of American strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And these do not remain, these remain intact in the free and open Indo-Pacific concept. And they are, firstly, open trade. Secondly, the freedom of navigation on the high seas. And third, and this is the most vital for this audience and for nations around the region, that there is the right to self-determination. There is the right to self-determination. That is the three key driving principles of this strategy, and in my view, the strategy that's driven the United States policy in the Indo-Pacific for 70 years. Now, I spoke of values and interests, so let's break that down a little bit in this context. On the interest side, what does this strategy get right? It gets the trade side largely right, notwithstanding, obviously, the large issues that we see happening at the moment. But the concept of free trade does remain the underlying principle of American policy in the region. Secondly, it absolutely underscores the value of allies. The value of allies is central to this strategy. Thirdly, engagement. And not just engagement between the United States and its allies, but encouraging its allies and its friends and partners in the region to engage with each other. And my friend Abe spoke about the rise of multilateralism, and that is a defining feature. On the values, so the values side, that equilibrium I spoke of that is so important to American strategic policy development. This strategy gets right, in my view, the right of all nations to seek their own path, to not place countries in a position where they're going to have to choose between two great powers. That would be a mistake, and I don't think this strategy goes anywhere near making that mistake. I want to talk about the underlying strategic assumptions, because anyone who's worked on a strategy, as Abe sort of eloquently put it, if you're not talking dollars, you can't ever talk strategy. That is a fundamental principle of anyone who's ever been involved in developing a strategy. We've all seen those sort of strategic statements and documents that come out and they ended up on the shelf of a desk officer and they don't go anywhere. I don't think this is one of those. This is guiding American strategic and foreign policy from here on in. So what are those underlying strategic assumptions? Firstly, competition with China. That's the elephant in the room and we have to address it. However, what it doesn't define is what the nature of that competition will look like. But it has to define that it exists. Secondly, upholding the norms that have served not only the United States well, but the partners, allies, and nations of the region well. That being the right of self-determination of all nations within the US-led rules-based order. I want to talk a little bit about the alliance system in the region, because there's been a lot of talk about the alliance system, the fracturing of it, the undoing of it, and I don't see it that way. I see the free and open Indo-Pacific maintaining the hubs and spokes system, but most importantly, and this is the most important thing, I think, for this room, it's the growth and encouragement by the United States of minilateralism, again, in US interests and supporting US values. So we've seen, as Abe spoke of, Australia, Japan, the United States is one that we're seeing move forward in a positive way. India, Japan, the United States. But not just those nations. Let's think about some of the announcements we saw come out of when Vice President Pence went to APEC in November. We've seen Papua New Guinea, the US, New Zealand, Japan announcing projects and policies together. Let's talk about the Southern policy and how that complements and integrates into the free and open Indo-Pacific, because I don't think they're parallel policies. I think they mesh well. South Korea, in my view, is the great economic miracle of the 20th century. Unparalleled what this nation achieved. Unparalleled. And sometimes I think that's not understood around the world. And I think that's an unfair thing. But it's our job to educate people about that, what this country has achieved. South Korea has a role in the region, and I'll tell you why. Because other countries have baggage. They have historical baggage. When they're seeking to integrate, they're seeking to work with other nations, particularly in Southeast Asia. Other countries, such as my own, does come with baggage. South Korea doesn't, and that is an opportunity. That is an unparalleled opportunity. And it's also an opportunity to say to the rest of the world that South Korea is more than about the Korean Peninsula. I want also just to quickly address, in that vein, the analogy, I think that's a lazy one that's often made at the moment between, the United States-Soviet competition, the US-China competition, and the lazy analogies that somehow history is repeating. I think that is intellectually lazy. But what I have taken from it is this. A crawl, walk, run approach. And the trade-off I make is crawl is consensus, walk is defining the problem, and run is developing a solution to the problem. I think the United States at the moment in that competition that Abe spoke of and others, I think the United States has gone past crawl. So I think there is emerging consensus that there is a competition with China. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Healthy competition leads us to innovate. Competition doesn't just need to be in the military sense or the political sense. It can be in the economic sense, and that is a good thing. That allows us to innovate. But we have defined there is the problem. I think the walk phase is now developing a strategy, and I understand the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy is a strategy for the region, but I don't think it's a strategy for China. I don't think that the United States has yet fully developed a strategy for China, nor do I think that they should rush to do so, because I think the problem is still yet to be fully defined and understood. The worst thing the United States could do, in my view, at the moment, and China, I'd argue, is to overreact. The United States is not seeking, in my opinion, to try and add countries into columns like they did in the Cold War. Again, these analogies that I've heard some people espouse, and including some people I've spoken to on the floor here, have kind of tried to make that analogy. It's wrong. It doesn't reflect the future, and it certainly doesn't reflect the present. The defining feature, and I think former Prime Minister Turnbull spoke of this, the defining feature of the region at the moment is not so much the hubs and spokes model, whether it be Washington at one centre or Beijing at the other. It's the greater regional integration, and what he referred to is enmeshment. And I think he's right. He's spot on. Nations like Korea, our friends in ASEAN and others working together, but maintaining those relationships they need to on the security side with the United States and the trade side with China. There is no reason that Korea or anyone else should have to choose. That is central to maintaining stability between the great powers and everyone else in the region. And I think the Southern policy absolutely is the right step in the direction for South Korea to make as it seeks to expand its influence and, most importantly, what it can offer the region, given the history of your country and the model that you have shown the world as the great economic miracle of the 20th century. And I look forward to, in some way or part, helping to not only be part of that vision, but to see it implemented. The final thing I'd like to say is I'm reading Alison's book at the moment. I'm a bit of a late reader to it. And, you know, what I've taken from it, if you talk about that sort of analogy where, you know, Mr. Kennan in 1948 wrote the famous telegram. And I want to talk about the rush to judgment. The Soviets, you know, their great experiment in history, their failed experiment in history, in 1918, it took the United States till 1948, 30 years, to come up with a way how they were going to manage the Soviet problem. 30 years. I think the United States has got time on its side, and I think that any rush to a defining strategy on China at this point would be a mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. I think it's very clear that our discussions this week have focused, that we've been hearing from the South Koreans this anxiety, and I think some of our comments have reflected that desire to allay that anxiety among the South Koreans when it comes to what this Indo-Pacific strategy will mean. Now, Joe, Ambassador Yoon, you've got the best position. You can either rebut everything everyone has said or produce some...
Well, thank you very much, Jean. It's good to be here. And it's good to be out of government so I can speak fairly freely, you know. I feel sorry for Ambassador Harris, you know. And we've had, you know, actually a variety of opinion. Patrick thinks U.S. strategy is just right, you know. Abe, you know, half and half. And we have Dr. Che, ton of reservations. I wanted to take the cue from Dr. Che and ask, you know, 3 very simple questions. And hopefully, you know, we can answer some of them, you know. What is U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, you know? I would say is, as you heard, is mostly about China. Second question is this what the region wants? I would say, unfortunately, no. Okay? The third question is, if you continue this path, where is it going to leave U.S.? My view is that it will weaken our strategic position in Southeast Asia, and it would damage us. And so let me, you know, so I've given you the answers, so let me try to justify those answers, okay? The problem about it being China, of course we're in competition with China. Of course we're having a real tough time with China. But I really do believe we have gone way beyond. If you remember, only about a decade ago, U.S. used to think China as a, what do we call it? A stakeholder. That if we brought them in, it would work out, all would be well, you know? Well, that wasn't true either, of course. But try to compete China on the basis of it's either us or China everywhere, it's just simply not going to work. And you've seen Dr. Che give his very, very well thoughtful view that this is not going to work for Korea either. You know, it's not going to work for Korea. It's not going to work for Southeast Asia. It's not going to work for most countries. Maybe the exception is Japan, you know, but that's a separate issue. And, you know, if you consider what the region wants more multilateralism, more a say, and more building up of their own institutions. And I really regret that our approach, the Trump administration approach, is so bilateral-centric that we are neglecting institutions that we have built up over the past decades. A good example would be ASEAN, you know. I mean, you've seen, building up of ASEAN, U.S. participating in East Asia Summit. And so we have helped build ASEAN as a center, so-called, ASEAN centrality. We have accepted ASEAN centrality. Now nobody talks about it. And so I think this is a shame, and it has lessened our presence in the region. And you can see that in many, many areas. In trade, we've retreated from TPP. We've retreated from the most significant trade agreement there was to be in the region that would have incorporated Asia-Pacific regions ranging from New Zealand, Australia, to Singapore, to Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and so on. And also, we have also retreated from the values area. I mean, who is to say what would have happened in Myanmar had we emphasized more values? We had, at great expense, normalized relations with Myanmar. And then you've seen over the past 2 years a real ethnic cleaning. 500,000 Rohingyas kicked out of their own country to be in Bangladesh. I'm not saying it would have happened, it would not have happened under different administration, but the fact that we said nothing, kept quiet about it, made it seem like all this talk about values is somewhat empty. I get that feeling, And so as a result, because of this absence, we are seeing countries moving away. If you give them a choice, they're going to move away. This has happened in Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, and we are essentially losing our strategic gains that we have made in the past decades. And this is, I believe, at the cost of putting everything on China. So to me, what is likely to emerge is much more fragmented U.S. position in the ASEAN region, as well, outside Northeast Asia. And this is a shame, I think. I think this is a shame because there are things that ASEAN can do for us that they can, that in fact provides much more secure equities for us. One example is Vietnam, Vietnam can and is willing to play much more role in resolving Korean Peninsula nuclear issues. They hosted Trump and Kim Jong-un, and they have good relations with the U.S. So I think, Vietnam is something that can help not just us, but regionally. But more than that, I think we're missing an opportunity to build ASEAN again, to be more of a partner to ASEAN. And if this continues, I don't think it's necessarily a good trend line. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joe. I am mindful of the time. We have about 20 minutes left. I do want to give some of you a chance to answer some questions, but first I wanted to ask the ambassador if he wanted to respond to anything he's heard here.
Actually, no, but I guess I will. So thank you. So I find myself in an unusual position. That is, I'm on a panel with a bunch of free thinkers, and I'm not so free in my thinking because I'm in government. But I thought I would talk just a little bit to respond to Dr. Che, and that'll sort of give you a sense of where the U.S. is. And then I'll quickly morph into talking about a couple of points that my esteemed and good friend, esteemed colleague and good friend Joe Yoon made. And then I'll stop and turn it over to somebody to rescue me or something like that. So first, I want to thank Dr. Che for his thorough description of the New Southern policy. And I'm glad that he clarified that it was his views and not the Republic of Korea's views. It's clear to me who the professor is and who the practitioner is, and I'm clearly on the practitioner side. And I believe that you can't have your cake and eat it too, in the sense that you can't rigidly separate diplomacy and economics on the one hand from security on the other. I'm glad that the United States has made choices over the years. I jotted some notes down here. We chose in 2019, this year, to support the legitimate acting president of Venezuela. We chose a few years ago to support Ukraine and its disagreement with Russia over Crimea. We chose to support the right parties in the Balkans in the 1990s. We chose to support Kuwait in 1991. We chose to support Vietnam in the early 60s. You can argue the merits of that, or you can you can read what Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore had to say about that. And then finally, of course, we made a choice in 1950 to support the Republic of Korea. And I'm glad that we have stuck by that choice for the last 66 years. Us, as well as the over 20 sending states that made that choice in 1950 as well. In 1953, Korea had a choice, as did North Korea. North Korea chose to ally itself with China, and the Republic of Korea chose to ally itself in a formal security alliance with the United States. I believe that South Korea made the right choice, and if you look outside on this beautiful island and you go to Busan or you go up north to Seoul, you'll see the merits of that choice. I think that I want to acknowledge and agree with Professor Che on his commentary about the New Southern policies seeking positions on fundamental values that matter to democracies and like-minded nations across the world. And so I look forward to the Republic underscoring the fundamental value of freedom of navigation and overflight and operating in the South China Sea. I look forward to the Republic and its views in supporting the U.S. position on the brutal repression of religious minorities in China, most notably the Uyghurs. I look forward to the Republic joining us in criticizing the weaponization of debt that China is doing, as well as the China's national intelligence law, which requires Chinese corporations to cooperate with intelligence agencies, which gets at the 5G issue that we're facing today. That thing right up there has got Huawei components. I'm sure that what I'm saying is being heard elsewhere. And then to Abe's commentary, he asked and answered his question, have we gone way beyond what we should do with China? I think you should ask any one of the million Chinese that are in relocation camps if we've gone too far. We turned a blind eye in 2012 when China built 6 or 7 military bases in the South China Sea. And despite their claims of not militarizing the South China Sea, they have these military bases there. And they actually claim the South China Sea as their territory. Have we gone too far in that? Should we turn a blind eye to China's weaponization of debt? and should we turn a blind eye to their national intelligence law, which affects our security and the security of our partners, friends, and allies. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And I did see Professor Che scribbling furiously earlier, so I wanted to give you a chance to respond. And also, I did want to ask you one question. You mentioned that you felt that the collaboration should be bilateral in nature, and we've heard some sentiment down the table that we should restore multilateralism. Can you explain that a bit?
Well, one of the reasons why I pointed out bilateral basis is instead of having some sort of minilateral, like trilateral, quadrilateral, including Japan, I think that would be a little bit of hesitation. There should be some sort of hesitation on part of Korea. Well, actually, I'd like to ask my fellow panelists two questions. The first one is that, well, yeah, in case of Korea, I think the response is not that hot, enthusiastic, right? So what sort of response do you feel from other regional countries like ASEAN? I think ASEAN is the center of the region that you want to pursue this strategy or vision, right? And the second question is that, well, recently, a couple of weeks ago, I traveled to Japan to talk about Japan's free and open Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific. And they say that it's not anymore a strategy, it's a vision. And also, Mr. Abe is emphasizing the inclusive nature of Japan's FOI. But they assess that, they evaluate that America is kind of trying to confront China, whereas Japan is trying to encompass or engage China, at least in a diplomatic way. So would that be kind of fundamental difference between U.S. and American approach about Indo-Pacific? Yeah, I'd like to ask the question.
Yeah, to directly answer Dr. Che's question, before going on to a couple other issues, I think the fact that Washington and Tokyo may have different thinking about China, or at least in terms of tactics, if not in terms of strategy, suggests that perhaps we're not signed on to the same strategy, but rather we're approaching our own strategies informed by our own interests and our values, which, while I think we're very much on the same page with a lot of issues, it's okay for allies to disagree on issues. And this is the broader point I wanted to make. And to address Ambassador Harris's point, at least I didn't intend to say that the U.S. has gone too far on China or that we should hold back on China. At least I didn't intend to make that point. What I did, the point I did intend to make is that every aspect of U.S. competition with China need not be an alliance issue. That our alliances, our partnerships are based on shared interests and shared values, that our relationships are not coercive, and that historically, our allies have been free to disagree with us on very key issues, and our alliances have survived. Canada did not officially send troops to Vietnam, neither did the UK. Throughout the Cold War, there's a wide variety of instances in which the United States and our very close allies disagreed on some important issue, the Suez Crisis, for example. And these alliances continue to survive and thrive. And so the fact that we may not agree with our allies on certain specific issues as it relates to China, to my mind, is okay. And it's not a statement about the health or success of our alliance. It's a statement about the fact that our alliances are not coercive and based on the sovereign ability of our allies to make decisions based on their own interests and their own values, and that our alliances can survive and thrive despite that. But that being said, I think there are some times where we do need to make a choice, and I think this is where I think the tricky part comes in, that sometimes there's issues that come through when they're so important, absolutely critical to our interests, that we need to take a serious look at actually making a choice that could be difficult for us. And to me, and again, this is just my personal opinion, THAAD is an example of that. The decision to deploy THAAD to the Korean Peninsula was an issue that the Korean government and the U.S. government decided was essential to our national security interests. And even though Korea paid a significant price for it and is continuing to pay a price for that, the decision by the governments were that we could not put Chinese sensitivities, to my opinion, baseless sensitivities, above our own need to defend ourselves. And that to me is an example of a dramatic instance in which we needed to actually make a choice. And I think the question is, and it's a case-by-case basis, is this issue so important that we need to make a hard choice, or is this another issue that good friends can agree to disagree, and we move on? And I guess that's my only reaction there. I'll stop there.
Shall we take a question from the audience? Please identify who you are, say your name and your affiliation, and who it is you'd like to address the question to.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Berger. I'm with the International News Agency AFP. I'd like to question for Harry Harris, of course, picking up on something that Professor Cho said and your own response to him. He talked about President Moon's desire to strike a balanced diplomacy between the US and China. And you yourself talked about the importance of choices being made. Now, so that means that Korea is a security ally of the United States, and at the same time is seeking to strike a balance between the United States and its greatest competitive rival, now and going into the future. What's the US view of an ally taking that position, and what's the implications for the future?
As Abe said, we're not asking Korea to make that economic choice. Countries, Adam Smith, talked about enlightened self-interest and all of that. So we all act in our enlightened self-interest. The concern is, and I don't want to point at Korea or any other country, but the concern that we have is when economic interests and other national interests cross into security interests. And that's the area that we then have to have that discussion with those countries and our allies. And I think Abe hit it right on the head when he talked about we have had disagreements with our allies, partners, and friends throughout our history, but he named some relevant near histories, and those alliances survived. And we haven't faced a question of what did Professor Jay say? Positions of fundamental values, and we haven't had that yet, and hopefully we won't. Hopefully we'll be able to work through those issues that begin to look like a question of fundamental values, and be able to work through them. That's what allies do. That's what friends do. That's what I do with my wife. I succeed miserably at that, but we work at it though.
Thank you, Ambassador. Another question?
I'm Spencer Kim with Pacific Century Institute. My question is to Abraham, who expressed the concern because of the difficulties Japan and Korean governments are facing. But there are a couple of issues. One is a rule-based conflict. The other is local domestic politics, both in Korea and also in Japan. So how do we help them solve that? I mean, it's great that if we can get them to solve this problem, but how do you do that? Where is the wisdom?
I think it's an excellent question, and I've spent a tremendous amount of time in Korea and in Japan discussing these issues, and I can assure you that the reason we're not we're having trouble with these issues is not for a lack of wisdom. There's a tremendous amount of wisdom here in Korea and in Japan. And it's not a lack of goodwill. I think there's a lot of goodwill in Korea and a lot of goodwill in Japan. I think the challenge that we face, I think we're facing three challenges, to my mind. The first is that we lack a safe space where we can discuss these issues openly. That I've been in innumerable discussions amongst Korean and Japanese scholars, off the record, no TV cameras, nothing like that, where we try to start addressing these issues and we can't get anywhere. And it's especially, and I've decided that the United States should not try to play a mediator in these discussions, because I've been in the role so many times where a Japanese scholar with the best of intentions will give their view of the issue, a Korean scholar will give their view of the issue, and then they both look to the American and say, so what do you think? And that's a terrible position when they're both your friends and you just want them to get along. So I think we're lacking safe spaces to have good discussions. The second, I think, is unfortunately domestic politics, both in Japan and Korea, push you both apart, left to their own devices. Unfortunately, there's gain to be made by politicians in Japan and Korea by emphasizing some of these issues, and I think that's unfortunate. And the third piece, and I think it's unfortunate, is that historically, I don't mean too dramatic, but in the past few years, we've been able to do more together, and relations between Korea and Japan have been warmer when the United States is encouraging both sides to sort of knock it off and focus on the issues, the shared interests that we have today. And that needs to come from the highest levels. And that people at the level that I was at, these sort of mid-level officials, can do some at sort of the quietly working level piece. But in order to make real significant change, in order to create a political space for this cooperation to occur, it needs to come from the highest levels. President Obama, whom I worked for, spent a lot of time with his counterparts in Tokyo and in Seoul. And the leaders there, Prime Minister Abe, President Park, took significant political risks in order to make progress. And I think they deserve the credit for it. I think President Obama played an important role in it as well, and we're not having that. And I think absent that push from the top level, the domestic politics is going to continue to keep each other apart, which I think is unfortunate.
The last time I remember something at that level really solved the problem was between DJ and the Prime Minister Obuchi. And they laid this thing and they solved it for that period. Let's bring it back.
Sounds like a good idea.
Good.
So I think we're going to wrap things up. I just want to say that it's been such a gratifying week. I have to say, for when we're talking about alliance issues, it's unusual to have a week of discussions where we don't talk about North Korea. And while North Korea is a pressing issue for all of us here, it's also good to carve out some space and discussion to talk about issues that don't directly have to do with North Korea. So I've learned so much from all of you. I want to thank you, and thank you so much for coming today.